All right, in this video, we're going to cover optionals. Now, optionals are one of those topics that can take a little while to get your head wrapped around. So I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. Please watch the concept video first before we just jump into the coding of optionals. It'll make a lot more sense, but let's see if we can do a little coding using optionals and see if it helps reinforce our understanding. So basically what an optional is basically creates an opportunity for a variable to not have any value at all. So for example, let's say I declared a variable called count and I said it is of type int or integer. This declaration, which is what you've been using so far, says that the box, when we go back to our analogy of all of the different boxes in our basement, the one that's labeled count will always have a value in it, always. It can never not have a value. And therefore, we can always just reference count, no problem. So for example, I'm going to initialize this to a 5, and I print count here, and I go ahead and run. I should get a 5, which I do. And I'm free to reference it, no problem. In fact, I could declare a new variable here, let's say new count, and I could say it's going to equal count plus 1. And let's go ahead and print out new count here and run, and I should get a 6, which I do. So this is what we've been used to, and this is all works just fine. But Swift has the concept that sometimes boxes can be empty. And that means in our relating that analogy back to our code, variables can be empty. And we discovered that optionals actually are used in dictionary lookups as an example. When we go to give a key to a dictionary, if that key isn't in the dictionary, it returns a nil. And a nil says, I don't have anything. It's empty. And that is the choice that we're trying to take on. So for example, if we wanted to say that count can take on values, but it could also be empty, then we put the question mark at the end of the type. This says now that it is an optional. And it's optional because it can take on a value, but it can also be empty. Now, because of that, this right here is now illegal. We cannot just reference count blindly because it is an optional. And the compiler will prevent us from doing that. It says that this must be unwrapped. And unwrapped is really saying we need to sort of use X-ray vision and look into the box and see if the value is there or not. And when you force unwrap something, you're not even doing that. You're basically just saying, I'm going to open the box. And the issue is if you open the box or you access the variable, you force unwrap it, and it is nil, you will cause an exception. It will crash. So the way you force unwrap something, though, and you will force unwrap things because even though the compiler doesn't know there's nothing in it, you may know that there is something in it. For example, right here, I assigned a 5 to count. So since I assigned a 5 here, this next statement I know is going to run. And I know for certain that count is going to have a value. It is not going to be empty. Therefore, I can go here and put what's called a force unwrap, which the symbol is an exclamation point. So when I add the exclamation point at the end of this variable, I'm force unwrapping it. I'm saying, don't even worry about looking inside. I know it's good, and we'll go get that value, and that's what's put into new count. And so if we run this, we get the same answer back, a 6. Now, when we were dealing with dictionaries, you'll probably have noticed that there were cases where the printout out here said optional. So let's look at that. If I put in count here and I run this, you'll notice that down here it says, okay, there is a 5 in the variable, but by the way, this variable is optional, and you didn't force unwrap it here. You just gave me an optional value. So the print statement is very informative because it's saying that you gave me an optional, which we're telling you means that it does need to be unwrapped at some point to be used properly. But we're okay with that, and we're just going to unwrap it anyway and look inside and see what it has. So in this scenario, that is what it does. It says it's an optional 5. How would we get rid of that optional? Well, we would just force unwrap it here. If I force unwrap it, the result of force unwrapping creates something that is not an optional. It's no longer optional. It's you've taken whatever is inside. So now when I run this, I just get the 5. And I just get the 5 because this is not an optional because I force unwrapped it. Count is optional, but with the exclamation point, you've force unwrapped it. Now, let's suppose I take this 5 out. Let's comment this out for a second and just use the print statement as is. Now, when I run this, we know that there is nothing in the count. We didn't assign it to anything. And because it's an optional, when we go to print it, the print statement's really nice and says, okay, you gave me an optional, there's nothing in it, so I'm going to print out nil. So nil is how we represent the fact that there is nothing in that particular variable, or you're returning something that is empty, doesn't have anything. But let's see what happens here. So now with it empty, if I say let new count equal an exclamation point count, basically another way to refer to this is bang. So you do count bang, which is basically force unwrapping the variable, adding 1 to it. So what happens when this runs? Well, let's try it. If I run this, now I get an exception. This is a crash. Your program is going to crash. And it's crashed because you force unwrapped a variable that didn't have anything in it. That's not legal in Swift. You cannot do that. So what you need to do is really test for things ahead of time before you force unwrap something or unwrap it so that you know you can do it safely. And that's what we'll cover next.